You're on ABC's Sunshine Coast, and there are concerns being raised this morning that access to the National Disability Insurance Scheme could be restricted to tens of thousands of people with psychosocial disabilities under changes mooted in a review of the scheme last year. And if you're wondering what a psychosocial disability is, it's essentially a disability caused by mental health issues, as distinct from a specific mental illness. You may have heard Kristen Gillespie on AM earlier describing what her experience of having a psychosocial disability is.
It feels like I'm trying to swim laps in an Olympic-sized swimming pool full of mud. I have terrible brain fog. I have a lot of trouble thinking clearly. I feel completely overwhelmed.
River Knight is a disability advocate from Developing Australian Communities. Good morning.
Good morning.
Why would people with this disability be worried that they will lose access to the NDIS?
Well, we've had the age-old debate between mental health and disability for a very long time. And before, of course, NDIS rolled out, we were just starting to get a little bit better at it and understand how we need to do that. Because traditionally, even here in Queensland, if you had a mental illness, disability service would say, that's not disability, that's mental health. Go to the Department of Health. They'll pay for your services. And then, of course, Department of Health would say, no, you've got a disability. Go back to DSQ and ask them for supports. And in the meantime, the person sits in the middle, doesn't get the supports, and then we end up with someone in crisis, and they end up with hundreds of thousands of dollars in a package on NDIS, as opposed to community services, which is the foundational services that you hear Mr. Shorten talking about a lot right now. So we have this argy-bargy rearing his head, and in the middle are people who really don't care who funds those services. And it's going to cost us a lot more if we don't get it right and get those foundation services in place now, before we start talking about cutting people from schemes that are unfortunately the only option for many.
And what would losing that support or not being able to access it mean to people with psychosocial disabilities?
Well, it means it's going to cost us a lot more. So when we're using funding as our rationale, and we hear these scaremongering stories of cost blowouts, it costs us a lot more when someone's in a mental health crisis and needs complete 24-hour one-on-one support services. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So what we want to do is go back to that community model. So we're not just doing NDIS as our model, because that's the most expensive way to do it. One-on-one, individually funded services is the only option, is a really expensive way. So we want to mixture. So we want to also have those community services where we say, we know that we need these services to exist so that people can access them when they need them. We set them up, the doors are open. If someone needs those support services, they come, they access them, they don't get to crisis point. And that's the best way to be frugal and sensible with our funding. And unfortunately, we've kind of gone too far to the other extreme with NDIS. And now the states are having the push back on them to say, those foundational supports need to exist so that people don't always need NDIS is kind of their only option sometimes.
And this isn't the only area where there are concerns about people losing access to NDIS. What are some other disabilities where there are fears that people could get shut out of the scheme specifically?
Well, one of the things that's a big issue is that the majority of people who have a disability will also have a mental health diagnosis or accessing NDIS. So we're talking in a very big cohort. The thing that gets really complicated is when we start going extreme and instead of individualizing people's supports, we start doing blanket yes and no responses to what we do and don't fund. We start cutting out people. So regional Australia is a really big concern right now, because the decisions to how we fund and support a person in the middle of a city surrounded by service options is very different to the decisions that need to be made for someone who's in a regional area that has very limited services and resources. So as soon as we start doing blanket yes and no's, we start having those issues where a person's individual experience and where they live becomes a huge point of discrimination and a huge difficulty in terms of accessing supports. They have a right to access.
And you, River Knight, and others have been ringing alarm bells about this issue for months now. Is there any sign that you're being listened to?
Well, unfortunately, even though co-design's a big thing at the moment, we're seeing a lot of it still done behind doors, and then we're waiting for announcements about things, as opposed to saying, you know what, this is what we're proposing to do. Let's share that around. Let's get everyone's feedback to see if we're really hitting the mark. So we're a little bit concerned because we kind of don't get to see what's being developed until they're at the point of going, well, I'm going to table this in Parliament. It's like, well, hang on, can you let us have a look first? So we're kind of we're still frustrated because the things that are being used to justify extreme changes are money, and the things that we keep raising are the fact that we're doing things in the most expensive way, and can we get back to basics with those foundational supports so people don't need $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year because we supported them 2 years prior before they got to a crisis, so we didn't have to wait until they were in a crisis and then it costs them 10 times more. So we're kind of disappointed that we're not doing those basic proactive things that stop things from costing so much.
Now, last year's review came after the current Labor federal government and the previous Liberal National Coalition raised repeated concerns about the cost of the NDIS blowing out. Do those concerns stack up?
Well, the supports are there, and we can't really argue with the fact that we have a community that needs those supports. So it's really about the bucket of funds. So whether it comes out of the NDIS bucket, or whether it comes out of the state bucket, or if it comes out of the Department of Health bucket or the disability bucket, that's really the argument of who's going to pay for it. But at the moment, we're kind of looking at it and going, yeah, but we're doing the most expensive version. So I guess that the hard part is around trying to get the community to understand so that this doesn't become a political issue. So when we have the next election, we know that people are going to say, oh, cost blowouts, and we're going to see political parties saying, well, we're going to rein in those costs, and we're not actually asking people to not spend or to spend more. What we're asking the government to do is to do things in a way that's smart and not hard. And if people can't get their head around it, think of it as, I service my car regularly so that rather than wait until the engine blows up, because it's going to cost a lot more to get a new engine than to service it regularly. And that's kind of what we're looking at with support services. If we can support the community so they don't get to a crisis, it means it doesn't cost us as much because we don't have everyone accessing services in a crisis because the system's so hard to access.
River Knight, thank you for helping us unpack that today. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much.